Welcome back, everyone, to another Lancer video, the last of the How to Play series for the specific types of mechs in the game. Today, we're going to be talking about the artillery mechs, and probably one of my favorite styles in the game. After this, though, stay tuned on the channel because this is not going to be the end of Lancer content. There will actually be more as I'm going to start my why this mech is awesome, which is going to go over each of the licenses and each of the mech frames, as well as the multiple frames that might be in each license. So if you like Lancer content, please, I'm going to ask you right now to just subscribe, as you're going to find more content here on this channel in the near future. But let's go ahead and get started on with today's video. So when we're talking about artillery mechs, we got to ask, what is an artillery mech? What defines the role? Well, artillery mechs are kind of defined as the long-range fighters in the game. They predominantly use heavy weapons or super heavy weapons, cannons, launchers, and a variety of rifles as well. But predominantly, they're going to be using the cannons and launchers because they have the arcing trait. The arcing trait allows you to essentially fire over cover, negating the cover. And it's really helpful for hitting enemies in hard to reach places, especially enemy snipers. In addition to arcing weapons, they also have a lot of weapons that have the blast tag, which does area in a number of hexes based on the size of the blast. Blast 1 is a 1 hex in all hexes around your target, and so on and so forth. This makes area damage really good if you're dealing with multiple enemy mechs that are in an area. And so, picking your targets is a very big part of what makes an artillery mech, though I'll get to that part in the tips and tricks section towards the end of the video. Last but not least, another part of a artillery or a different style of artillery are to utilize seeking weapons and smart weapons. Seeking weapons are different from arcing in the sense that they are not necessarily going over the target, but instead seeking the target out as long as there is a way to reach the target. This makes it good for hitting enemies that are in cover, like with cover overhead. That's very useful, and smart weapons also target enemies using their systems rather than their evasion. This is really good for targeting specific type of enemies, though these last two weapon tags are only used sparingly, as your major thing is the heavy firepower from long range. You want to make the enemies either get into cover or try to rush you, where hopefully your teammates will intercept them. Moving on to the frames and systems, overall, the license matters more than really the frame that you're picking up. While a lot of the artillery type frames do give some benefits to artillery stuff, the biggest thing are the weapons. Weapons are your main thing. It is important that you very much pick a weapon that uses a style that you enjoy, especially because a lot of these are main heavy or even super heavy, which are going to take up some of your primary slots on your mech. So when you're playing an artillery mech, or when you're picking what mech to go with, look for weapons that suit your specific playstyle. If you like being the gunboat in the back of the group, look for heavy or super heavy launcher or even cannon type weapons. But if you like a mech that is really good at getting around terrain and stuff, maybe you want to go with a smart seeking type of artillery mech. In any regard, look at the weapons found in each license, and then pick a frame if you have the ability to that, fits your playstyle. In fact, one of the great things about artillery is that as long as your mech has good enough weapon mounts, any mech can really be turned into an artillery mech. Whether some mechs are better than others, that's understandable, but still, it's mostly in the firepower. So as long as you got the right kind of gun, you can be an artillery mech no matter what mech you pick. So let's go ahead and talk about the Monarch and the Viceroy, which is from the newest book, Duskgrave, and what they do. Because as far as mech frames, they're really good. Now the the Monarch mech that you can see here has a really good sensor range, which makes it good for utilizing systems that take advantage of its range. though you don't need high sensor range to use most like cannon launcher weapons that have a huge range. Sensors are only important if you have systems that utilize, that distance. So don't worry about your sensors necessarily as much, as it only allows for systems and not your guns to hit. So you can have low sensors and still play an artillery mech more or less. But along with the sensors, it has actually a pretty good starting HP, good evasion and E defense. It's pretty like standard. Now, their frame traits, Avenger silos are really good once per round. When you critical with a ranged weapon, you deal 3 explosive damage to a different character of your choice within range 15 and line of sight. So Avenger silos are really, really good. You're in the back line, you're getting a bunch of accuracy maybe to your stuff using ranged weapons. This allows you to just add extra damage to the battlefield. Super good. And then Seeking Payload is also really good and uses one of our primary weapon types, which is the launcher weapon. If you use a launcher weapon to attack a character with lock-on condition, it treats it as if the weapon had Seeking, but you must consume lock-on during the attack. This is amazing because launcher weapons typically are only arcing, so if the enemy has cover overhead, you're not going to be able to hit them. But the Seeking benefit allows you to shoot a missile and then it kind of goes off course and then slings inside, which is a really cool effect. And when it does so, the attack's damage cannot be reduced in any way. So this makes, as long as you're getting the benefits of lock on, which since you're playing the Monarch, you have a large sensor range to lock on to enemies anyway. You can lock on, fire your launcher, and you can use that lock on to seek that enemy. They can't reduce the damage in any way, and if it is a critical, you can then damage another enemy within 15 hexes. Really solid and very, very good. Monarch is personally one of my favorite mechs in the game. I feel like it does gunboating really, really well, and it has all kinds of really cool things in its license. If we look here at its weapon mounts, you can see that it has a heavy mount, a main mount, and a flex mount. The heavy mount is really important because you can stack that with one of the other mounts to make a super heavy mount that you can use for big cannons, big launchers. Very, very solid. And then you still have another either flex mount or a main mount, which honestly, the flex mount is really good. You can put 2 aux weapons on it. So you can have 1 super heavy weapon and 2 aux weapons like the light LMG or like the Oracle LMG, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But last but not least, there is their SSC-30 high penetration missile system, and it has an active effect. It's their core system. It's called Divine Punishment. It's really good. You choose any number of characters within 50 hexes, which is the whole battle map. If you're in a map that has more than 50 hexes, that's a massive map, I'll tell you. The targets must then make a agility save or take a D6 plus 4 explosive damage, and on success, they take half damage. These are self-guiding missiles and can each reach any target as long as there is a path to do so. So essentially, they're seeking. That is the Monarch, and you can see why it really benefits having a artillery-style Monarch. Is it just has a lot of really good uses for artillery playstyle. But the Monarch license also comes with the Viceroy frame. Now, the Viceroy frame is a new frame from Dustgrave. And one of the reasons why I like it is it has a lot of the same stats as the Monarch, but you can see here its sensor range is a little bit lower, 10 rather than 15, but it has a higher save target, and I think actually a higher speed. I didn't check that point before. But its traits are where it really shines, as it also is a launcher favoring mech. It has the near threat targeting processor, treats a launcher weapon as if it is a close quarters combat weapon with a threat of 3. So that means that even if the enemy manages to get up to you, they are still in danger of being shot by your threat or overwatch, which is really good and very, very powerful in a sense. So it makes it so that even if an enemy gets up on you, they're still not safe from you, which is really good for countering one of the main kind of flaws of playing an artillery mech, is they don't do well with enemies in close range. The Vigilante Omnidirectional Launcher is not as good as once per round on a critical hit, similar to the Monarch. The Monarch deals 2 explosive damage to all characters within range 3 of itself and knocks them back 1 space. Good for keeping enemies pushed away, but it is only useful if the enemy gets that close to you, which you already really don't want. The near threat targeting processor is good in case an enemy gets close to you, but this one is more like you're banking on not only an enemy being close to you, but also getting a critical hit, which are just two things that you don't necessarily want if you're playing an artillery playstyle. Granted, of course, you can play the Viceroy in a different way than artillery. I'm just mentioning this in particular as this is an artillery video. But, you understand. Pressure plating is really good. It gives a resistance against explosive damage. So even if it gets caught up in its own explosions, it's capable of doing so. Also similar to the Monarch, it has a heavy mount, but rather than a main mount, it has a flex mount and an aux mount. So if you're using a super heavy weapon, it's going to be heavy flex, and then your aux is going to be for aux weapons. Pretty much what all you can really utilize it for in any regard. Its Tengu assisted missile tubes is super good though, as its active core power. You center a burst of 3 missiles on yourself. Hostile characters in the area must succeed on a hull save or take a D6 plus 3 explosive damage and be knocked prone. On a successful save, they take half damage and remain standing. You may consume an affected character's lock-on to make them automatically fail the save. And before or after taking this action, you may fly up to your speed, ignoring engagement and reactions. You must end this movement on solid ground or begin falling. This is really good, and it's a quick action as well. This allows you to, in worst case scenario, blast a bunch of enemies that are swarming up on you, and then get away by flying. The Viceroy is the safer of the two options between it and the Monarch, as its benefits are mostly for if an enemy gets close. But I would say the Monarch is overall the better artillery mech, as its main focus is predominantly about striking enemies from a long range. In any regard, the license itself gives you access to a variety of missiles, like the Shuranga missiles, which has a range of 15 and is arcing, or the primary one, which is the Gandiva missiles, which same range, but does a D6 plus 3 energy damage. It's accurate, seeking, and smart. This is also a heavy launcher. The Pinaka missiles are if you want to go full super heavy launcher. It has a range of 20 and a blast of 1. It does 2d6 explosive damage, and it has arcing, but it also does 2 heat to your mech when you fire it. So you can't just kind of unload with this one unless you have a really good engineering. Also, the Pinaka missiles makes 2 blast areas in this range, though they can't overlap. You may also delay the impact of the attacks made by this weapon. You choose the 2 target areas, which become visible to all characters. The missiles land at the end of the next round. After all characters have acted, you deal 3d6 explosive damage instead of 2d6, but you become slowed until the end of your next turn. So you can kind of mind game enemies with the Pinaka missile. I really enjoy this one particularly, as it allows you a variety of things, and you don't need to do the delayed action. You can just fire at, your massive range 20 with the weapon. The Javelin rockets are also something I want to mention as well. This is more of a mind game thing, but it's another system that utilizes like the Monarch's vast range. But you choose 3 free spaces within a range 15 and line of sight that aren't adjacent to each other. All characters know which these spaces are, and you fire a volley of auto-targeting missiles into the air. When you do so, enemies that enter into those spaces take 3 kinetic damage, and then the effect disappears. It's a quick action. It allows you to either set up a lot of spaces that the enemies can't go to, or just to create zones where the enemy has a harder time getting to you. This is really good, and Javelin rockets are something I recommend a lot of artillery mechs take, as this gives you some kind of defense against enemies. You can create zones as long as they're not, adjacent to each other, that the enemies can't necessarily get into. Overall, I know I spent a lot of time talking about the Monarch and the Viceroy in this case on this section, but it's because the Monarch is kind of like the premier artillery mech in the game, and thus a lot of the stuff in its license are just good for any kind of artillery mech, no matter what mech you're playing. So something to keep in mind when you're picking up your license levels is once you get your frame, you might want to start looking at Monarch if you want to add to your overall artillery repertoire. Next up, I want to mention the Pegasus, the strangest mech in the game, and you're about to see why. Now, this is a particularly squishy mech, as, I mean, it has about the same amount of HP as the Monarch, 0 armor, though it has a better E defense. And one of the reasons why I say it's kind of squishier is it doesn't get as many defensive systems as the other mechs do. It has a sensor range of 10, so it's not as far as the Monarch, but as I mentioned before, doesn't necessarily matter for artillery mechs, as the weapon is what you really want to care about. And of course, about the same save target as the Monarch as well, with a 10, which is pretty solid, but it does have a good number of system points to add on. Now, its frame traits. Gun, or extrude gun. Gun. This makes sense when you look at its passive for its core system, which we'll look at here in a bit. But that is pretty much the Pegasus in a nutshell. It doesn't make sense, but gun. All gun. Always gun. Extrude gun. Anyway, the next one is, by the way, I know everything, which is really absurd. When you roll damage, the Pegasus can instead deal the average damage based on the number of dice rolled. So if it rolls a d3, it does 2 damage. If it rolls a d6, it does 4. And it makes sense. Essentially, you just take the average plus 1, essentially, and that's what you're going to get. It tells you all here 4 examples. This must be decided before rolling for damage, so you can't, like, opt to take the higher damage. You have to take average or whatever you roll, in any case. That makes the Pegasus really good at doing very consistent damage, and as an artillery mech, damage is kind of your whole thing, so consistency actually is very beneficial. So as you can see here, it has a heavy mount and 2 flex mounts, which actually make it better than the Monarch, as no matter what other mount you're utilizing, you can take a normal mount or 2 auxiliary mounts, while a main mount typically can only have a main weapon or 1 auxiliary. So it's a very, very solid setup for whatever kind of launcher cannon you want to utilize. But let's look at its passive core system, which it has access to at all times, which is the Omni Gun, which is a gun that is all guns but no guns at the same time. Yeah, it has a range of 15 and does one armor piercing kinetic damage. And how it works is at every round, as a free action, you can just deal 1 damage to a character within range 15 and line of sight. It's not an attack. It hits automatically, ignores cover, bypasses immunity, and its damage can't be reduced or ignored in any way. No rules supersede this. It doesn't matter. Every round, the Pegasus is dealing damage to you. It's a horrifying mech that you need to deal with. Otherwise, it will chunk you down, because that 1 armor piercing shot can't be reduced in any way. Doesn't matter what you do. It ignores cover. So as long as you don't have, like, a mountain between you and this mech, it's going to do damage to you. It's horrifying. And its active is even more horrifying, as when you unshackle the Ushabti, that's what I think it's pronounced. It's a protocol, and for the rest of the scene, you can use it 3 times around instead of once per round. And considering it's a free action, that means it's just doing 3 AP kinetic damage that you can't ignore or get away from every round. That's messed up and horrifying. And range 15, yeah. As long as it can see you, has some kind of line of sight to you, you're screwed. So the Pegasus mount is really, really good. Now, it also has a pretty good cannon, the auto gun. The auto gun is a range 15, 3 kinetic cannon. What it does is it's just, like, it's a main cannon, but you don't fire it. You can't actually fire with this weapon. It's just when you have it, it just automatically at the end of your round, well, I guess not automatically, but as a free action at the end of your turn, you can fire with it, though this particular cannon doesn't benefit from your talents or any triggers you have. So why this is really good is, 1, it's a cannon, which is one of the artillery weapon types that we're going to benefit a lot in whatever your build is. But whatever your super heavy is, which super heavy guns typically, if you're using a super heavy anyway, A super heavy gun is like a full range barrage action. So whenever you fire a super heavy, you can't necessarily fire any other guns that round. But the auto gun allows you to do so. So the auto gun's just really solid on top of whatever other kinds of cannons or launchers you might have. Overall, the Pegasus is a really solid license, even if you don't pick the frame, even though the frame is absolutely horrifying. Last but not least of the mechs I'm going to talk about here today, are the frames, is the Barbarossa, and this is the premier gunboat, the big boy, the largest, I think the largest base mech in the game. I don't know if they've added another size 3 mech, but Barbarossa is like the biggest mech in the game. It's a size 3, it's the size of a small apartment building, and it's a very heavy duty mech. It has 2 armor and 10 HP, making it the tankiest of the artillery mechs that we've seen so far. It does have, it's very easy to hit. It has low evasion, low E defense. That's what the armor and HP is for. Its sensor range is the same as the Pegasus and the Viceroy. 10, not as good as the Monarch, but that's okay. Again, not a big thing. Really sucks at tech attacks, kind of lower on the system point end, but it is the gunboat character. Now, it has a heavy frame, so it can't be pushed, pulled, knocked prone, or knocked back by smaller characters. This is really good. It prevents you from being pushed away by like enemy cannon fire or anything, as long as that character is not your size or bigger. Technically can be a thing, but then you're fighting a whole spaceship. So yeah. It has resistance to explosive damage, which is really good. Makes it good anti-artillery, as it doesn't take the same amount of damage from other artillery type of enemies. It is a Colossus enemy, so other characters can use it as cover. Not optimal for an artillery playstyle, but a benefit if you're fighting with another artillery mech. And it's slow, so it receives a difficulty on its agility checks and saves. But this mech is the big one, as it has a heavy mount and 2 main mounts. Now, this makes it actually kind of worse than the Pegasus, and strangely, as you would expect this mech to have the, I would say you'd expect this mech to have the better mount overall, but because it's lacking in flex mounts, it's just a heavy and then maybe some normal, but it's still gonna hit. It still has the capacity to use a heavy or a super heavy mount and another main mount, so this is going to do a lot of firepower. You're not going to be worrying about auxiliary weapons necessarily on this one, and you can have different types of weapons. Maybe you have a cannon a seeking cannon, or maybe you have some kind of launcher weapon that has arcing. In any regard, you have a good amount of weapon mounts to do what you need to with this particular mount. But let's talk about its core weapon and integrated weapon. So it has the charge rail as its core system, and or I should say the apocalypse rail is its core system, which as an active effect it can start charging its apocalypse rail, and it's literally a ship to ship mount, or like integrated cannon that is built into the Barbarossa. It's really cool. Now, the cool thing about the Apocalypse Rail is, so I mentioned before that you start charging as a quick action. This is your active. So this is not like a passive integrated weapon that you can just fire. If you're going to use this, it's got to be like what you're using your core point for. But the thing is, if you don't end up firing it, you actually don't expend the core point and you regain it at the end of the scene. So even if it doesn't get off, it's still really good. So what the benefit to this one is as long as you're holding still, you don't become stunned or jammed, your apocalypse rail is going to get stronger and stronger. As you can see here, at charge 4, it does nothing. It's in its beginning phase, and it does no extra damage. But even just with one charge, it gains a range of 20. It has a blast 2 and 2d6 explosive damage. That's really, really good. And objects that are within the affected area take 20 armor-piercing explosive damage after the attack. The blast cloud lingers, providing soft cover to characters within the affected area until the end of your next turn. So you can blast away general objects like turrets or anything very easily using the Apocalypse Rail, and that's after 1 round of charging. So as long as you haven't moved for 1 round, this is already like quality of a super heavy weapon for any other mechs. But if we go to charge rail 2, the range increases to 25. It gets 3d6 instead, and any objects in the area take 40 AP explosive damage. And on a hit, characters become shredded and impaired until the end of their next turn. There's the still blast cloud that does give them soft cover, but this one is burning. And if a character starts to turn in the area or move into the area for the first time, it takes 4 burn. That's massive. That means that even if the enemies are getting cover from this because you're hitting them with it, they're being burned away by the incendiary damage from the apocalypse rail. And if you get it all the way charged up, the range maxes out at 30, which is, I think, the biggest range in the game. I don't think you can get more than that. Has a blast of 2, which is normal. 4d6 explosive damage, which I think, again, is one of the highest levels of damage in the game. And it take any objects in the area take 100 explosive damage. Enemies become shredded and stunned until the end of their next turn. The ground is completely vaporized. So for the rest of the scene, the blast area becomes difficult terrain, and characters get the same soft cover that they received before. But when they start their turn in there, which they will because they're going to be stunned, they're going to take that 4 burn damage. Now, firing the Apocalypse Rail is a full round action, and if you're firing on anything 3-1, you can't move or take any other actions on the same turn. So when you're firing this, you got to know you're going to fire it. This really pays off for how the Barbarossa works, which is it stands there, it doesn't move, it fires on you, you try to shoot it, and it just doesn't work. And more importantly than that, when it does hit you, it absolutely hurts. The Barbarossa is super good, and it gives you access to one of the most powerful super heavies in the game, which is the Siege Cannon. Has a range of 30, 2 blasts, does 3d6 explosive damage, and you can either choose to fire it in siege mode or direct fire mode. Direct fire mode is less range, and it gives 2 knockback and heat to self. Siege mode is arcing, it's ordnance, so it has to be the first thing you do in a turn besides protocols, and it's a loading weapon, so you need to load it, and it does 4 heat to yourself. So overall, this is probably one of the best cannons in the game that you want to put on a artillery mech, granted only if you have the heat capacity to deal with the heat bleed from this particular gun. So on top of the frames I mentioned before, which I know this video is already getting kind of long, but I want to make sure that I get this one out because this one is a very big one and a very important one to me personally. Let's talk about some other weapons that you can pick up from some of the other licenses. Like, let's start off with the Emperor's Bolt Nexus. This is a really good weapon. It's a Nexus weapon, so it doesn't really benefit from any of the cannon or launcher stuff that we mentioned before. But what I like about it is it has a range 10 at first and deals 1 energy damage. But once you hit a target, they become target acquired. When they become target acquired, you can move the range up to 20, and it does 4 energy damage. This weapon is also seeking and gains reliable force, so even if you miss, it will still do its damage. And it is a smart weapon, which means it targets their E defense instead. So in the initial form, it is a smart weapon, so it's really good against enemies with low E defense, but even after you hit any enemy, it doesn't matter. It gains reliable force. It always does its damage. It never misses, and you can, after you hit at that 10 range, you can move up to 20 range, and you'll be fine. It's really, really good. Next up, I do want to talk about the Oracle LMG. I did mention this before when talking about the Monarch. This is an auxiliary rifle, so this is really good if you have a flex mount remaining on your mech, because you can take 2 of these. It's a range 15, which is pretty good. It does a D3 kinetic damage, which is pretty solid. And it's accurate, meaning you get a +1 to hit with it, and arcing. So even enemies behind cover are not going to be safe from this weapon. It's a really solid weapon to utilize with your playstyle as you're keeping back. This is just a really, really good backup weapon in case the enemy gets close or anything like that. and it's just really solid for dealing with any super heavy weapons that you might be also utilizing. So just something I wanted to mention for this particular playstyle. All right, so this video is getting already a bit long in tooth. Let's talk about the talents I recommend for your artillery playstyle. First, I'm going to recommend Heavy Gunner. Its biggest benefits is that it utilizes range to your benefit and suppresses enemies. This is really good for either keeping dangerous, like close range enemies from getting closer to you, or for assisting your allies from a distance. So as covering fire, which is the first part of the talent, you can pick up covering fire, which allows you to target an enemy as long as you're wielding a heavy ranged weapon and within 10 spaces. Most of these mechs, as I mentioned, had a heavy mount, so this is really good for utilizing that mount. Now, the target becomes impaired until the start of your next turn, but they can move, which removes the impaired condition, but you may also attack the enemy with your heavy mount, and it deals half damage, heat, or burn, and the effect ends. You can make this attack at any point during their movement, and waiting until they exit cover, for instance. And covering fire can only affect one character at a time. So you can't do this multiple times until later, which I think you can do, bracketing fire, which allows you to do this with 2 enemies rather than 1. But the biggest one is Hammer Beat, because what Hammer Beat does is it allows you to, if you successfully hit the target, they become immobilized until the end of their next turn. So Hammer Beat can force an enemy to get stuck out in the open. Utterly dangerous for a lot of enemies. Now, this does require you to be a little bit closer, but since a lot of these mechs had like a 10 sensor range anyway, that might be where you just end up in a particular battlefield. Heavy Gunner is just really good if you're in a smaller battlefield and you don't want enemies to get close to you. It's overall a very solid one, and obviously when you use cover firing, just like a quick action, you can then hit enemies on their turn when they just move. Very good, very, very solid, and something that I think really benefits the artillery playstyle. Next up, I'm going to talk about Siege Specialist, which is really good to add on to your artillery mech, because the big thing is if you're using a cannon, which I mentioned earlier is the 2 types of weapons we're going to be focusing on. As a quick action, you can fire kind of from an underslung launcher a jackhammer round that does 10 kinetic AP damage to a size 1 object within range. Any characters that are adjacent to said object are knocked back 2 spaces and take 2 kinetic damage. As an artillery mech, being able to take out enemy ranged units in any sense, even if they're like sentry turrets, is very huge. Jackhammer rounds are very good for getting rid of these kind of things, so it really benefits you and your allies to take something like this. But this also gives you some defensive qualities, as with impact, if you attack with a cannon, all adjacent characters to you must succeed a hull save or be knocked back 1 space and prone. You are then pushed 1 space in any direction. This can create some instant space, and it's a part of attacking, which you're probably going to do as well. So if you are getting into a tight situation, this allows you to, hopefully anyway, knock a bunch of enemies away from you, knock them prone, and knock you away so that you can then boost or do whatever you need to get away from them. So good defensive qualities as well. Collateral damage is really good because whenever you perform a critical hit with on a character or object with your cannon, you may choose to cause the explosion to fire off secondary munitions, causing a burst to explosion around the target. Characters within the affected area drop prone as a reaction or take 2 explosive damage and be knocked 2 spaces away from the center of the attack. This makes your cannons really good. It can separate enemies from their allies by forcing them to spread out, or they take kinetic damage and are pushed away anyway, or they just become knocked prone, which helps. So overall, Siege Specialist is really good and really annoying to deal with if from the enemy's perspective. I actually really like Siege Specialist. Last but not least, we're going to talk about Stormbringer, which is the launcher talent. The Seismic Deluge, which is the first part of the talent. Once per round, when you successfully hit with a launcher weapon and consume lock-on, you may also knock the target prone. Really good, as long as you're targeting enemies or using lock-on and then, targeting them with it, you can just knock enemies prone. This is really good. This super benefits the Monarch's playstyle. And so Stormbringer, I think, is just designed for the Monarch. Stormbending gives additional benefits. You customize your mech with an auxiliary concussive missile system. So once per round, when you hit a character or object with a launcher, you can choose one of the following effects. Lightning, you fire a concentrated blast of missiles. The target must make a hull save or be knocked away from you by 3 spaces. The force of the firing knocks you back 3 spaces away, so this gives you extra defense, similar to Siege Specialist. You can fire an enemy with a launcher when they're running up on you. If you hit, you can choose to make them make a hull save. They go 3 spaces away, but it doesn't matter if you hit them or not. You fly back. Well, I guess you do have to hit them, but it doesn't matter if they make the hull save or not. You fly back 3 spaces, which can possibly put you out of their range. Now, Thunder is also really good because you fire a spray of missiles of a burst 2 around the target. Characters in the area must make an agility save or be knocked back 1 space away from the target. The primary target is unaffected. So this can spread enemies out, similar to Siege Specialist again. So Stormbending is very, very solid, and all it's contingent on is hitting the enemy, which should be pretty easy. Torrent is amazing. So you get a Torrent die, and it ticks down from a D6 down to 1. And it does so whenever you use Stormbending. You lower the die by 1. So every time you hit the enemy, essentially, it lowers the die by 1. And when it reaches 1, you can use Massive Attack on essentially the next round. Massive Attack is you target a character within line of sight and range 15. They must make a agility save or take 2d6 explosive damage, become stunned until the end of their next turn, and are then knocked prone. On a success, they take half damage, but are still knocked prone, but are not stunned. This action can only be done when you have a torrent die of 1, and when you do so, it resets your torrent die. This just makes it so that as long as you're doing what you're already doing, which is hitting with your launcher, you're just going to get access to a really strong attack that automatically makes the enemy prone no matter what they do for their agility save. That's really good. So now that we've gone over some talents, let's go over some core bonuses that you can select. Now, I have a GMS one, so anyone can take this as long as you can select a core bonus. This is improved armament. This is for mechs that do not have enough for like a super heavy. You have to have fewer than 3 mounts. So if you have 1, 2 mounts, you can then add an additional flex mount. This is really important because if you have a mech, for instance, that has like a heavy mount and another mount, you can now add a flex mount on top of it to add some extra auxiliary firing power or whatever. This is just for mechs that all the mechs today I mentioned have 3 mounts, so it doesn't apply to those. This is just to make other mechs into an artillery mech if you like another mech's frame traits a little bit more. In fact, I'm also going to mention super heavy mounting because it's a little bit better. Now, this is a new one from the new Dustgrave book as well. And what it does is if your mech has 3 or fewer than 3 mounts, as I mentioned before, you gain a super heavy mount. Now, this can't be cheese to get 2 super, you can't even get two super heavies. But if you have a heavy mount, the super heavy mount will also have to utilize that heavy mount. So you can't pair it up and get like supreme firepower with this. But if you have a mech that has like 2 flex mounts or something, adding the super heavy gives you a super heavy weapon while still maintaining another flex mount. So overall, super heavy mounting is very solid and can get you access to a super heavy cannon, launcher, whatever you're looking for, if that's the way you want to go. And the last trait I'm going to mention here is from Smith Shimano. So if hopefully there's a lot of good artillery mechs in Smith Shimano, so I recommend going into their licenses for sure. But Neuralink targeting is just going to be my recommendation. It increases the range of all your weapons by 3. It's really good. It's very, very solid because you're already shooting from like a 15 range more often than not. So you're going to be very close to hitting at that 20 hex range. It's just going to make you even better at your job. So, long video. I'm so sorry. Let's talk about what tips and tricks I have for you guys. First of all, terrain is your best friend. Considering you have arcing, as long as an enemy is considered in line of sight, you can fire over terrain to hit them, even though they still benefit from cover anyway. It allows you to strike enemies even if they have like full cover. You can also utilize this to your advantage, firing from a covered position and striking enemies at a distance as long as you have some way of, seeing them. There are even some seeking weapons that allow you to just completely ignore cover, and it doesn't matter where you are as long as a line can be drawn between you and the enemy. Overall, this pairs off well with like Neuralink that gives you the extra range, and mastering positioning is massive for artillery mechs, as your whole thing is utilizing your massive range against the enemies. Speaking of actually utilizing your massive range, your main focus should actually be long range enemies. Because you see here, the whole benefit of having a team is that you cover for each other's weaknesses. Your allies who are mid or close range are going to be able to intercept mechs that are going to want to get close to you. They're protecting you, so you gotta do the same. Targeting the long ranged enemies prevents your mid range allies from suffering from, doing their job of intercepting enemies. So if you target the long range enemies first, you are making your allies' life significantly easier. And considering that you're the artillery style of mech, you're going to be focused on that heavy range damage. A lot of your mechs are also kind of anti artillery with explosive resistance, so you're just really good at dealing with enemy ranged mechs, and this saves your front line from taking unneeded extra damage and can give extra benefits to your team as well. And last but not least, keep your distance. Spending an action to keep a solid like 10 hex range away from enemies is worth it rather than like attacking or doing a full barrage or anything like that. Because once the enemies are up on you, you lose your advantages as an artillery mech. Even though I did mention a variety of ways that these mechs can defend themselves, those are just actions you're going to have to use later to push enemies away from you, just so that you can try to get back to an optimal range where you do your most damage. On top of the fact that you're also do a lot of blast damage, you just don't want to catch flack from your own weaponry. So, taking an action or even boost, like even using your overcharge to boost away from enemies is very worth the time and effort. Allow your mid to close range allies to block enemies off while you get to a safer range. It's just necessary as an artillery mech. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching this incredibly long video. I'm sorry that there's just a lot to the artillery mechs, and I also just really like them. But hope y'all enjoyed. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.